Welcome back to Inside Politics. Our guest today, Dr. John Weil, political science professor from Middle Tennessee State University and the dean of the Honors College down there. Dr. Weil, we're talking about the president's summit this week with Vladimir Putin. Not too many years ago, when he was vice president, Joe Biden told Mr. Putin he was a man with no soul. The two leaders have also, before the summit, exchanged comments that seemed to accuse both of them of being killers. The president now says his goal of his foreign policy is to have a positive outcome coming out of the personal relationships with foreign leaders. Does that mean Joe Biden is maybe reassessing his idea that Vladimir Putin has no soul?
You know, it was sort of a good campaign line. I think, you know, without getting into too much spirituality here, everybody has a soul. Some souls are blacker or more corrupt than others, and you know, Putin grew up in the KGB. He's known to have assassinated or tried to assassinate his enemies. We certainly need a president who is aware that, you know, when they're dealing with him, they're not dealing necessarily with Winston Churchill. But it sounds like each took the measure of each of one another, and both realize that their opponents are fairly formidable.
President Biden gave Mr. Putin a pretty large list, 16 parts of the U.S. infrastructure in terms of cyberspace that are off limits for attacks by the Russians or by third parties. If that happens, as you mentioned, Mr. Biden says he will act in response. That's a pretty strong message. Mr. Biden said later that he's pretty sure Mr. Putin doesn't want a Cold War, but if Mr. Putin crosses the line on the things he's talking about, isn't a Cold War where we're headed?
Well, again, it goes back to the statement I made about Obama that, you know, it's sort of one of these red lines. And the problem with the beauty of red lines is they're very clear, but the problem is if he crosses the line and one doesn't do anything about it, then your bluff has sort of been called. I guess my primary question with that list of 16 is, you know, from my perspective, why should you be engaged in cyber terrorism of any kind? You know, I'd hate to think that maybe there's 16 other areas that Putin would now think they have a green light for.
It does appear that on the positive side that there's some indication out of the summit that perhaps on a lower level there's going to be some talks about coming up with a way to protect cybersecurity systems that are protecting the nuclear systems in both countries. Is that perhaps the only concrete sign coming out of this, that there may be an effort to try to negotiate our way out of this rather than to threaten?
I think that would be positive. You may remember, I can't remember which summit it was, but the phone line that was during the Cold War, perhaps Kennedy, maybe Eisenhower administration, you know, when there was a phone line where they could make immediate contact in the case that, you know, it looked like nuclear war might be around, or there was, you know, some concern that they weren't otherwise able to do. So, you know, diplomacy doesn't always work, but it sure beats having to send people into battle.
Both countries have more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over. It appears now that cyber espionage is perhaps the way world powers now conduct wars against themselves.
Well, you know, we had something similar, didn't we, with, you know, if you think back to 1989, you had the fall of the Iron Curtain, and we were supposed to get this peace dividend, and within 11 years, I guess, later, 12 years later, you had the attack on the World Trade Center, which sort of, you know, moved the focus from state actors to non-state actors. And this may be another, you know, sort of transition. You know, when I went to graduate school, I don't remember reading a lot about cybersecurity, but now I would guess it's probably one of the main emphases of the American military.
Much of the president's trip focused on Russia and rebuilding America's relationship with his allies, but China came up more than a few times. Is it likely the president's going to have a similar summit-type meeting with President Xi?
I'm not sure. I do think that, you know, one of the tensions in this meeting is we need to give renewed attention to our allies in Europe, in part because Trump took such an adversarial position regarding them. But China really is, I mean, it's the rising power. Their Belts and Road initiative has, you know, given them sort of entrees into a lot of different societies. But their aggression or apparent aggression toward Taiwan, all of these are very concerning. On the other hand, China has some problems. Most notably, particularly if it is found that COVID may have in fact originated in their labs, this is a terrible, psychological damage. It's like, yes, it's a power and it's accomplished a lot, but they seem to have taken some shortcuts, not only perhaps with COVID, but also in the environmental area. We're celebrating the launch of 3 Chinese astronauts into space, but just a month ago, we know that they were dumping, that they were not recovering the rocket as it went into space, and so they seem to have taken some shortcuts, which might end up catching up with them.
A couple of developments around the summit that seem to be moving more towards dealing with issues around China. There was a truce between Boeing and Airbus over the trade fight they've been having,
Yes.
a 5-year truce for that. But at the same time, while that seems to be between the U.S. and the European leaders, this really was more aimed at China because they are the developing market and they're having growing influence within the air industry, developing their own planes.
Yes, and one of the things that, one of the charges against China, I don't know that would be true necessarily as something as sophisticated as airlines, but one of the charges is that they're effectively using slave labor, or certainly involuntary labor, and anytime that happens, you might have a cost advantage, a competitive advantage, and surely we do as a culture, we have much more in common with our European allies than we would with communist China.
Dr. John Weil of Middle Tennessee State University is our guest. We've been talking about this week's summit between President Biden and President Putin. Back to continue that conversation after you watch these messages.